Canada is said to be the pioneer of a points-based selection system for immigrants. There is a global competition for attracting skilled immigrants from around the world to fulfill the long-term and short-term needs of immigrant-receiving countries. To meet these needs, an effective immigration system was needed, which would be efficient and would simultaneously evaluate the skills of immigrants. In 2015, Canada took an initiative by the introduction of the Express Entry System, a points-based system to offer permanent residence to skilled applicants. The Express Entry System, although an inspiration for all immigrant-receiving countries when it comes to economic immigration, is faced with ethical and administrative dilemmas. In this week's special report, Canadian Immigration News was joined by Dr Oldrich Bures. Dr. Bures is a former head of Department of International Relations and European Studies at Metropolitan University Prague. His areas of research focus on international security and conflict resolution. Dr. Bures was also amongst the team of Czech researchers who wrote the paper, The Strengths and Weaknesses of the Canadian Express Entry System. We asked him about his research and looked to find ways by which Canada can improve its Express Entry System.
All right, so we are joined here today by Dr. Oldrich Bures from the Czech Republic, who's kind enough to make time for us. Dr. Bures, as a researcher on primarily security affairs and counter-terrorism, we are eager to know what prompted your interest in migration policy, in specific, the Canadian Express Entry System.
It's a part of our larger research project, which is primarily focused on the Czech migration policy, but it's a research project which is so-called applied research, which means that all of our findings and conclusions should not be just published in terms of journal articles, but should have some policy relevance or some practical real-world implications. And one of our so-called applicant guarantors is the Czech Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, and they were specifically interested in learning from the Canadian migration system, and more specifically about express entry, the most sort of recent evolution when it comes to selecting skilled labor. And thus they essentially asked us to do an analysis, a preliminary analysis of the first years of the functioning of the system. And to make it short, there was nobody in our research team who would be a specialist on Canada or on Canadian migration, so I was asked to do the lead. But just to make sure that I was essentially invited to this research project because of my security expertise. In Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe in particular, there is lots of discussion about securitization of migration. So this is what is my key sort of contribution to this larger research project, but I was also sort of made the lead researcher on Express Entry.
What did you learn from the Canadian Express Entry System? What is your take on it in terms of what it is? Do you think it is a model that countries like the Czech Republic or other countries in the so-called Western world would take inspiration from?
I'm pretty sure it's a model, or it's part of the Canadian migration system that is worth exploring. And Canada itself, when we did the research, has learned from Australia and from New Zealand before introducing Express Entry. I also think that some of the challenges that Express Entry is trying to deal with or address, and that also are challenges that are common to other, let's say, advanced economies, especially it's the growing age of the working population, and then shortages of skilled workers in a number of key sectors in the economy. And since these challenges are similar to both Czech Republic, I would say other European countries, and in Canada, I think it's worth exploring how different countries have handled it. And certainly Express Entry is one of the systems that many countries, not just Czech Republic, have looked forward in terms of what could be learned for the Czech context. At the same time, I would like to highlight that we always warn the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs in Czech Republic that the Canadian experience with migration is unique, or certainly not the same as of the Central European countries like Czech Republic, which have relatively little experience with migration, at least in the recent history, certainly not comparable on the scale with the Canadian experience.
So the point-based system that makes Canada's immigration policies, migration into Canada, very unique is called the Comprehensive Ranking System, which is the CRS system. Do you think a system which is subject to constant change, as you've evaluated in your report, can accurately reflect the skills of immigrants?
I would say that's one of the tough challenges for any migration system, and I would say that all of the systems are struggling with this accuracy of evaluation of the credentials of migrants. So again, it's not a unique challenge to Express Entry or to the Canadian migration system. Our research suggests that precisely the flexibility that you can adjust the points and how the comprehensive ranking system is set up, also how many invitations per year, and with how many applicants and to what economic program are the invitees to be invited, prospective migrants. That flexibility is quite crucial, and especially because the Canadian system tries to address or somehow make assessment of both human capital. So if you want more of the soft skills, such as education credentials, but also for important age. And at the same time, the perspective that the immigrants will actually succeed on the Canadian labor market. So primarily related to job offers or prior experience working already or studying in Canada. So the more or the better mixture of these points or assessments you can make, the more likely it is that somehow you will hit the target. But at the same time, it's always inherently difficult to do. All governments struggle with sort of matching the labor market needs with sufficient numbers and sufficient qualifications of immigrants. So it's a constant challenge, but I think the Express Entry is doing reasonably well precisely because it can be adjusted at relatively short notice.
So you say that the flexibility of immigration policy in Canada is crucial to its success. However, it is also listed as amongst the weaknesses in your report. So is flexibility a strength or a weakness when it comes to Express Entry?
Overall, we would argue, and our research suggests, just to clarify, our research was based on literature review, of which there hasn't been that much except for a few policy reports. When we started doing our own research project, which was in the spring of 2019. And this is why we went for an explorative research design, and we interviewed 20 experts, Canadian experts, both from the academia, the provincial and federal level governments, and the non-governmental sector. So basically, it reflects the opinions of these experts in addition to the already published studies. And all of them agreed that flexibility is a crucial strength of the Canadian Express Entry system. What we were also wondering, and this is potentially where it could come as one of the weaknesses, and this is, if you want, the centralization of this flexibility under the ministerial instructions of the Ministry of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. This is relatively unique, at least in case of the Czech Republic. The power or the competences to deal with migration are spread at least across 4 different ministries. So we were wondering why this is the case. Flexibility is precisely linked to the centralization of power. The potential weaknesses could be that there is relatively little oversight by the parliament, which was mentioned also by several of our respondents, and that also in terms of learning lessons from other countries, or for other countries, excuse me, this centralization of power is predicated on a large, I would say, political and also societal consensus of the value of migration for the Canadian society and economy overall. So you don't have major shifts if the minister changes, which could be easily the case, for example, in many European countries.
Well, that being said, you also talk about the consequences or perhaps the problems of administrative depoliticization, which comes with the flexibility, which comes with a lack of parliamentary oversight in terms of immigration policies in Canada. How would you describe this phenomenon of administrative depoliticization when it comes to immigration policies in Canada?
Yeah, this is what we got also from several of our respondents, and their key worry was that with this concentration of power and lack of oversight from the parliament, that it also leads to disengagement from #1 Canadian media, and because of that, also lack of sufficient attention to this Canadian Express Entry and its impact on migration to Canada in general for the public. And this comes at the times when migration, perhaps even in Canada, can be, let's say, abused for political purposes by various political parties or even, let's say, non-political groups. So the worry was that while express entry actually is very good in terms of publishing, or the government does a good job in terms of publishing lots of data on how many people were invited, who actually accepted the invitation, all the details about the system, how many points you need to get selected, etc. At the same time, the system may be a bit too, let's say, complicated, and precisely because it doesn't get enough scrutiny in the parliament, it's also not picked up sufficiently well, even by the mainstream media. So because of this lack of attention, it can lead to this, what they call administrative depoliticization, essentially the lack of attention by the media and by the general public.
Now, coming to the ethical side of economic immigration, some would equate a market need-driven approach to, in fact, skimming talent from around the world. Is Canada's approach to immigration encouraging a brain drain? In your opinion, is the idea of economic immigration altogether an ethical idea?
Brain drain is certainly one of the problems of all immigration programs all over the world, which try to attract high-skilled labor, especially, or higher-skilled labor. So certainly we were asking this question. We got somewhat different answers, where some of the respondents suggested that we should, number one, keep in mind that express entry is just one part of the Canadian migration system, or the economic class, as it's called in Canada, and that you have also important classes in terms of family reunifications and refugee class. So it's part of a comprehensive mixture. It's also perhaps important to highlight that it leads to permanent residence. So it's quite a unique feature. So in theory, it should eliminate some of the abuse, let's say, of the temporary workers that otherwise you find with much of economic migration. But at the same time, I think it's difficult to deny that from the perspective of the countries of origin, or the sending countries, as it's sometimes discussed in the migration literature, the brain drain is very real. And Canada and also many European countries, while they try to encourage high-skilled migration, they at the same time try to spend quite a bit of money on development assistance to precisely, if you want, do the opposite, to make sure that, for example, you have doctors in the hospitals in the developing world, and you have enough teachers to teach the kids in the developing countries. Of course, if they pack up and leave, then they are missing there. So it's undeniable. What we also found in the research of the Canadian migration system is that there is also what many respondents call the brain waste. And they argue that this is actually more of a problem than brain drain, because in their opinion, the people that want to migrate will migrate no matter what. But whether they are actually capable to find jobs suitable or adequate to their qualifications, especially in the licensed jobs, so precisely doctors, but also, for example, electricians, anything that you need to have a license for to practice the job in Canada, is frequently not the case. So you are basically not utilizing the full potential of many of the migrants that actually reach Canadian soil.
Now, staying with brain waste, your report talks about a gap between theoretical skills and actual skills. Now, is the express entry system focused solely on what you label as theoretical skills? Is that a problem in the express entry system?
It's one of the criteria. So if you apply and you get invited because you have enough points in the comprehensive ranking system, then you need to prove your credentials, and especially in terms of education, but even your prior work experience, language knowledge, and etc. And some of the things you can sort of evaluate. So you can take language tests and whatnot, but some of the things, and this is what we talked about, the gap between theoretical skills and real world skills or soft skills, are very difficult to assess, especially if you don't do what some of our respondents have criticized, if you don't do oral interviews with the immigrants, which Canada has sort of discarded in the early 1990s. So this is, I would say, one of the potential challenges of a fully digitalized system, but perhaps some of our respondents argue that even if you do interviews, it's very difficult to assess, for example, the skills that immigrants earned from their prior work experience, because it may be also culturally sensitive, how you handle time, for example, how you behave culturally, how you behave in meetings. These are things, these so-called soft skills, which may differ from culture to culture. And even though you may have 20 years of managerial experience from a different country, it may not be as useful in the Canadian context.
Well, we must understand that immigrants do face a lot of troubles and worries in assessing and verifying their credentials. When it comes to the assessment and verification of the credentials, in your humble opinion, is there a degree of hegemony involved? Is there a sense of Western hegemony here, where certain skill sets from certain parts of the world are preferred and certain skill sets from certain parts of the world are not preferred?
We haven't asked this specific question, so this would be purely my speculation. But based on what I just mentioned, there is certainly a preference for, let's say, people who can function well in the context of the receiving country. So in that case, that can function well in the Canadian society. Primarily, of course, on the labor market, because sort of the jobs and how you succeed in terms of the jobs is seen as the key to everything else. In terms of the larger integration of the migrants into the Canadian society. What also I would perhaps add, and this is coming from our research, what we found relatively unique, and we were not, for example, quite sure whether that's transferable to the context of the Czech Republic or other Central and Eastern European countries, is that these credential assessments are outsourced to third, trusted, accredited, but still private parties, entities, essentially. Credit evaluations or certificate evaluations companies, I would call them. So we were quite puzzled actually with that. All of our respondents suggested that it works just fine in the Canadian system. We would be a bit worried how that would work with the private sector, or if it was fully entrusted to the private sector in our own country, in the Czech Republic. But as far as we learned from our respondents, it works very well in the Canadian context.
Now, there appears to be a dichotomy between Canada's short-term labor needs and Canada's longer-term economic growth, which Canada plans on meeting by this flexible introduction of immigration's levels plans, which vary from year to year. After the pandemic, the latest immigration's levels plan from 2021 to 2023 plans on welcoming over 1.2 million new permanent residents. Is this large number focused on long-term goals, or is it a short-term?
I again would be speculating because our research was conducted in 2019. The numbers that you mentioned are certainly higher than they used to be, at least for the period when we looked around 2019. Whether it's because of COVID or something else for us, this is very difficult to say. But certainly this challenge that you mentioned, long-term development, socioeconomic, perhaps even nation building, I would say in the Canadian context, and short-term labor market needs, this is sort of what we could trace as an ongoing struggle in the design of the Canadian immigration policy. The predecessors of express entry, the point systems, of which Canada is kind of a pioneer, was introduced already in 1967, if I'm not mistaken. And there has been always, if you look since the 1967 introduction, there have been always sort of shifts in the Canadian migration policy. However, at some periods, especially when there was, I would say, major shortage of labor, the short-term labor market needs were prioritized. And at other periods, it was more the socioeconomic, if you want, human capital skills, which are perhaps in the long run more conducive, and some would argue important for the integration, successful integration of migrants in the Canadian society. And again, I would say this is an inherent challenge or struggle which you also find in other countries. So I would say this is not unique to Canada. Specifically to express entry, I would say originally it was very much designed with these short or shorter labor market needs in mind, because you could receive 600 points when it was introduced for the job offer. That was substantially reduced to 200 points for the managerial jobs, but to 50 points for most of the jobs on which people get selected. which I would say, or we interpret it based on the interviews that I've had done as this sort of reprioritization towards longer integration, human capital development needs of the Canadian society. But you could see that even over a relatively short history of express entry, you had a major shift in these priorities, whether it's short-term labor market needs or long-term development of the Canadian society, if you want to call it in that way.
So you talk about this shift in this relatively short period of time since the inception of the Canadian Express Entry system, and an interesting comment made by one of the experts who were a part of your study was that Canada's Express Entry system is kind of a tap on, tap off. So how does this tap on, tap off attitude reflect Canada as a multicultural society? On one hand, is Canada serving its self-interest? Does it speak to the problems that could potentially occur in a multicultural society if immigration is taken as tap on, tap off?
I would say there is a twofold or two-part answer to that. The respondent who mentioned that was primarily connecting this to the flexibility, to the issue which we already discussed, and I believe in his view, flexibility was a strength, certainly, because it precisely allows you to do this adjustment to the current labor market needs, but perhaps also to the longer term development on the, let's say, of the Canadian society at large. So that's, I would say, the positive perspective. Of course, the negative view or the less positive view could be arguing that by this tap on, tap off, you actually keep a lot of people in the waiting room. So while essentially one of the key achievements of Express Entry was to eliminate the backlog of cases, I think we lost the connection. I'm not sure whether you can hear me now. So I will try to stop the recording. I will resume it. I'm not sure whether it's the same for you. So on this tap on, tap off question, the positive view, which was sort of voiced by the respondent, was that it's related to the flexibility. So with the flexibility, you can really take control on who you let to Canada, and ideally also with what kinds of skills. And it was highlighted by several of our respondents that while Canada is a country of immigration, and we were always amazed how everybody showed us thumbs up in all of our interviews, essentially migration is good. You don't see that often in Europe, certainly not in Central and Eastern Europe. The explanation was that one of the key reasons why the Canadian government has maintained this positive attitude, and that it's also largely accepted by the public, is that you are able to present that you are in control of migration. So it's not some, if you want, unregulated stream of migrants, but that you keep control on who is actually admitted to Canada, and that you admit the right people if you want. So in this way, the tap on, tap off is positive. We've also heard sort of a negative or more negative view of specifically related to express entry, which essentially suggests that while it has indeed managed to eliminate the long waiting times, which before the introductions were several years, and the backlog of cases which were not processed, there is a problem that essentially the people or the prospective migrants which don't have enough points to be invited are essentially waiting indefinitely. So you have an indefinite waiting room, you just don't show it in the system because these people don't show up, if you want, in any statistics other than that you have to resubmit your profile after each year. So in that way, yes, the tap on, tap off may not be, let's say, a positive feature if you are the less qualified migrant that tries to come to Canada.
So now, by express entry and by the economic class, as you may be aware, 60% of the new permanent residents are said to be a part of the economic class. Does this imply a class-based preference on the part of Canada? Are they prioritizing a certain class when it comes to immigration?
Again, we were not asking this question. All of our respondents have stressed that while yes, 60% roughly is the economic class. All of our respondents were very keen to highlight that there is this complex package, as I already mentioned, that you also have the refugee class. And in terms of numbers, that's certainly more substantial than many European countries. And then also that you have the family reunification class. Perhaps it's also interesting, something for us that was interesting, that while 60% is the economic class leading to permanent residence, it's actually about 18 to 20% of the actual applicants, because they can apply also with their nuclear families. And that then increases this overall number to the 60%, but actually only those 18, 20, at least initial years, were the ones who were ranked in the comprehensive ranking system. And one of the criticisms which was mentioned by some of our respondents was that Canada is not actually assessing especially the spouses of the applicants, and that you may be missing quite a bit of talent. But just to highlight that sort of in a hidden way, at least in our reading, you have family, you can call it reunifications or family applications as part of the economic system that is economic class migration that's handled under Express Entry.
Now, retention, again, is one of the concerns that your report brought up, that about 25% of male immigrants between 25 to 35 years old are likely to exit Canada within 5 years. How do you see the problem of retention in the future? What can Canada do to address it?
I think Canada is trying to do quite a few things already. Already when you are applying the whole system, that it's relatively transparent, that anybody can try, how many points you would actually get. If you are invited, you can take advantage of these sort of job matching services, training courses in terms of language, getting adjusted to the culture. There are at least, and this is of course beyond Express Entry, which is just about the selection of migrants, but some of our respondents also mentioned the programs related to integration and retention of migrants, that there is quite a bit of that, interestingly much of that at the provincial level or sometimes even at the city level. But it's of course a challenge, and it's important to highlight that Canada in this way is competing with many other countries, developed countries which are trying to attract higher skilled labor to their economies. So the competition is tough. I would say from our perspective, Canada is doing reasonably well, certainly better than, for example, in my own country, Czech Republic. But it's a struggle. And the more countries are trying to do that, the more difficult it will be to retain migrants, even for Canada. The data that you mentioned comes from an external study. And essentially it suggested that, yes, especially the younger age or, at the best time for the employment opportunities, they essentially are very picky. So if Canada doesn't offer them the best deal, they just pack up and they go for another deal in another country.
Now, you talk about this global hunt for talent and this global competition that is seeking talent from around the world. What does that mean for nation building? As an outsider, of course, when you look at the Canadian immigration system, how effective is immigration as a nation building tool?
I think this is very historical and cultural, or contextual, as we call it. So I would say the Canadian context here is very unique. Canada is a country built on migration, or that's how it was sold to us. And the percentage, I believe it's 25% now, and maybe up to 30% in 15 years of citizens of Canada actually of not being originally born in Canada. So this is a very substantial percentage, even let's say in international comparison. And there is a very long historical tradition of migration to Canada. Again, some of that related to economic migration, but not all of that related just to economic migration. Plus, I would say there is also certainly a unique feature in terms of sort of using immigration as a population development, if I can call it, tool, because many of the provinces are still relatively, at least in European standards, again, underpopulated. And thus you still essentially want people to move into certain territories so that you actually have, let's say, a viable population on these pieces of land.
Sorry to interject here, but your report does talk about the problem of dispersal, the problem of the top 3 cities in Canada attracting most of the immigrants and them not being able to be spread out across the country. How can Canada improve this problem? How can they mitigate?
Again, this is only partly related to express entry because express entry is primarily about selecting of migrants. But perhaps one of the things which we found out and it's a potential weakness of express entry is that only a portion of the so-called provincial nominee programs under which the Canadian provinces can also utilize express entry to attract higher skilled labor. Some of it is not administered via express entry, but the federal government sets the overall caps. And while all of our respondents argue that both the dispersal problem that you mentioned and this sort of provincial nominee caps have improved, or the cooperation between the provinces and the federal government, it seems that many of the provinces are still not entirely happy with the quotas that they have, and also in terms of the federal government, let's say, information sharing with them when they readjust, for example, the comprehensive ranking system, etc. So I would say the dispersal problem, again, that's very typical that many immigrants tend to land in the major cities because you have other migrants already there, so the communities and also the job opportunities. But it's certainly a challenge that's difficult to resolve. Also, in Canadian experience, precisely because all immigrants that are administered under express entry receive the permanent residency status. So once they land in Canada, even if they were recruited by the provincial nominee program, they cannot be forced, at least if we understood it correctly, to settle in a specific province. So express entry by design doesn't give you that much, if you want, power in terms of shaping where the immigrants that go through these systems actually go. But as we understood it, it's beyond express entry. Once you get permanent residency, your rights cannot be restricted to move around Canada. So I don't see perhaps any major solutions on this selection side. It's then again about the integration programs and retention programs, what the different provinces, if you want, can offer.
Now, coming back to selectivity and the selection process, express entry is the selection of the best and brightest from around the world. Now, when the best and brightest from around the world come to another country, what would that mean for existing Canadians who are in the labor market? Would that put them at a disadvantage?
There is certainly, if anybody who comes to the labor market increases, if you want, the competition. At the same time, it's, I would say, important to highlight that the initial data actually suggests that there is a shortage of these high-skilled labor applicants coming to Canada, because if you look at the cutoff scores, they were around after the job requirement was dropped and the 600 points for that, it was essentially in the lower 400s. So these are not very high scores if you consider that the 1200 is actually the maximum. At the same time, it's also important to mention that if there is a job offer, it needs to be accompanied, if the applicant is selected, by the labor market assessment, if I'm pronouncing again this mechanism correctly. And this labor market impact assessment has to prove that there is no Canadian or permanent resident actually capable of taking that job. Again, a specific caveat which some of our respondents have mentioned, this applies only to the principal applicants who go through express entry, not again to their spouses, not to their children. They can basically take any jobs without labor market assessments when they land in Canada. So there is certainly increased labor market competition, but again, it's important to keep in mind why you have the immigration program, the economic class in the first place, which is shortage of labor, especially in some sectors of the economy. So I would say then the assessment should be based on sectors, but certainly as all developed countries, Canada has a shortage of labor force, I would say of all kinds, certainly the higher educated, higher skilled, but even at the lower skills, you have a shortage. So there is competition, but Again, from my perspective or from our perspective, if you didn't need migrants, you wouldn't have express entry.
True, true. That brings us to the very last question of our discussion today. Dr. Bures, as you know, express entry is a relatively new process. What, in your opinion, is the future of it? Will nations from around the world continue to take inspiration from Canada, or does Canada have something to drastically improve?
We were always sort of assured by our respondents that express entry is, to quote, a living system. So in many ways, it builds on the points-based systems which existed before its introduction, and that it's something that's constantly evaluated and adjusted. From our perspective, what we are quite amazed and what we really admired is that the ministry maintains several departments which really collect the data, which of course is much easier when the system is fully digitalized. And they try to keep statistics on also the well-being of immigrants once they land in Canada through especially tax records. So you have fairly good idea about how they are doing in economic terms and then in larger, let's say, reintegration in the larger Canadian society. I think that's a huge inspiration. We haven't seen that in, I would say, any other country that we've looked onto. At the same time, can Canada learn from other countries? I would say certainly. It was pointed to us in the interviews that express entry would not be there or in the same shape if there wasn't substantial experimentation prior to that and learning from that experimentation in Australia and in New Zealand. So it's not that just other countries are looking to Canada. It's quite obvious that Canada is also looking around and trying to learn how other countries are doing. Before they talked about this, it's a global competition for talent. So it's something that countries look to each other constantly in terms of attracting the best and brightest.
So with that being said, this has been Dr. Oldrich Bures joining us from all the way from Czech Republic. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Bures.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.